working doggedly to create that world in community and in solidarity with others. And I will pass it off to Juliet.
Hi, I'm Juliet. I use she and her pronouns. I started thinking about abolition when I started thinking about punishment and about revenge. And I started learning more about the prison systems and police unions and realizing how corrupt the system we have in place is. When I started realizing that abolition is about leading with empathy and humanizing all people, I realized that I wanted to live in that society. I will pass it to Brittany.
Hi y'all, I am Brittany. I use she, her pronouns. I am an abolitionist, and I first got introduced to this concept when I attended my first poly-ed with White People for Black Lives about 3 years ago. And ever since then, it's just radically transformed the way I view the world and the way that I want the world to be in the future. So I'm excited to share that information with you all tonight. Welcome to the Political Education Abolition House Party, a very loaded title we are going to try and demystify over the next 90 minutes. We're so glad to have all of you here with us today. It is essential to gather in community in whatever shape that's now taking to connect with folks close to us around anti-racist political education. We have the opportunity now to connect virtually on a national scale and share this information far and wide. We follow the leaders and organizers, including but not limited to Angela Davis, Ruth Wilson Gilmore, Miriam Kaba, and Critical Resistance, who have been fighting for abolition for decades. We do not claim to be thought leaders or experts in this work. Much of the content we will look at today was developed by those just mentioned. You will receive the resources that we use in this session in the follow-up email that you get after this. The purpose of the session today is to provide you with information and tools around abolition and to discuss the history of policings and prisons in the US that brought us to this moment. We'll look at the ineffectiveness of reforms and how they're different from abolitionist steps we must take to create a world where we don't need prisons and police. These steps are possible and they are happening right now.
Thank you, Brittany. In this moment, empowered and frustrated and tired people all over this world are taking to the streets or protesting from home to demand a transformation to the violent systems that steal Black lives. As we do this, it is essential that we remember on whose land we reside and move, because we cannot fight against one pillar of white supremacy while ignoring another pillar. That is the unique violence that the indigenous to this land have experienced and continue to experience. With that in mind, White People for Black Lives acknowledges the Tongva peoples as the traditional caretakers of the land we currently reside on. That is the Los Angeles Basin and Southern Channel Islands. We seek to honor the land and the courageous people who have been its stewards, modeling a tradition of resistance-seeking liberation, as we witnessed recently with the removal of Los Angeles' statue of Saint Junipero Serra, who is responsible for the creation of California's mission system. We pay our respects to ancestors, elders, and relations past, present, and emerging.
Thank you, Matt. So just a little bit of housekeeping as we dive in. Because there are so many of us on the call today, almost 900 right now, we will not be able to answer questions directly that you're putting into the chat. We do have some chat monitors that will do their best to answer short logistical and tech questions. But in terms of big questions about abolition, we won't be able to answer those today. We will be asking for your responses in the chat at various points throughout the session and encourage you to interact with us in that way. We know this topic brings up a lot of questions often, and hopefully we're going to attempt to answer many of those throughout this time together. And we will also be sending out materials after the session that include frequently asked questions about abolition in a handout that can hopefully also answer some of those questions if we don't get to all of them today. Lastly, we are going to have a couple of points in the session where we have some time for personal reflection. So we encourage you just to be ready for that, whether you like to write with pen and paper or type on your computer. If you're watching this with somebody else, you can also do those as short discussions between yourselves. So we're excited to dive in.
Hi, I'm so sorry to jump in. It seems like some folks are having a problem seeing the slides and the speaker and are only seeing the ASL. If you look at the top of your screen, it might be on the bottom of your screen, it should say you are viewing Julia, she, hers screen, and then say view options. If you click on that, it should give you a side-by-side mode, and you should be able to see everything. Sorry, Juliet, please continue.
Thank you for that clarification, Christine. So continuing, what is White People for Black Lives? White People for Black Lives is a white anti-racist collective and activist project within the national network of Showing Up for Racial Justice, or SURJ. White People for Black Lives is the Los Angeles affiliate of SURJ, and our primary solidarity partner is Black Lives Matter Los Angeles, along with other LA-based organizations. Those of us facilitating are all a part of the Political Education Committee, and we organized the session that you are attending this evening. If you want more information, you can visit awarela.org, which we will put into the chat.
And what is Showing Up for Racial Justice, or SURJ? Showing Up for Racial Justice is a national multiracial network of groups and individuals working to undermine white supremacy and to work toward racial justice. Through community organizing, mobilizing, and education, SURJ moves white people to act as part of a multiracial majority for justice. White members are asked to organize from a place of deep mutual interest alongside Black, Indigenous, and people of color-led movements as we fight for racial and economic justice. We're joined tonight by Elizabeth from the Catalyst Project, a white anti-racist collective in the San Francisco Bay Area and movement partner of SURJ. Elizabeth is going to share a piece of her story and how she joins abolition work from a place of mutual interest. Elizabeth?
Hi everybody. I'm so thankful to be here with y'all. My name is Elizabeth, she and her pronouns, and I'm here in Oakland on Ohlone land. And I came to abolition as a feminist, as a rape survivor who wanted no one to go through what I had gone through. And I came to abolition from a deep love for and solidarity with survivors of sexual violence. It was through the stories of Black survivors and from the work of abolitionist feminists such as Andrea Ritchie, Angela Davis, Beth Ritchie, and Insight Feminists of Color Against Violence that I learned that there is no policing in prisons without sexual violence. From strip and cavity searches to the endemic rape of gender-oppressed people of color in police custody, sexual violence is the everyday reality of policing and prisons, and one of the means by which the system maintains power over those it captures and cages. Policing and prisons developed to protect chattel slavery. And let us not forget that chattel slavery was a system of terror that put a profit motive on the rape of Black women. You cannot take sexual violence out of policing and prisons. So if you want to end sexual violence, you have to fight for abolition. I'm also the child of an incarcerated person, and I'm someone who had really shitty experiences with police as a young person. I know from my life that police and prisons don't keep us safe, that they amplify harm. I also know from reading, listening, and organizing with systems impacted Black women and gender oppressed folks that white supremacy and white privilege has shaped every experience I've had with police and prisons. As a teenage rape survivor, school police intervention made the harm I was already surviving so much worse. But I didn't find myself in the sexual abuse to prison pipeline that so many Black girls do. When my mom would call the police in moments of mental health crisis, they didn't help her, but they also didn't murder her like they do so many Black women, such as Kayla Moore, Tynesha Anderson, Natasha McKenna, and Michelle Cusseau, among so many others. I could say a lot about how my father's, uncles, and cousins' imprisonment has devastated my family, and how white privilege has mitigated that devastation every step of the way and in profound ways. I fight for abolition because I feel a moral imperative to do so, especially as a white woman, but also because the world being created by Black-led and centered movements for abolition is also a world where my young self would have gotten the care and protection that all children deserve. Because that world is also a world where my mother would have gotten the quality mental health care everyone deserves. Because that world is also a world where my grandma doesn't have to worry about her children dying in a cage during a pandemic. Black-led abolitionist movement is the path there. If you too are a survivor, have loved ones inside, and especially if you've been locked up yourself, I want you to know that you are not alone in this space, and that your leadership is needed. Your story, experience, wisdom can be a powerful catalyst for abolitionist change, and you can be an incredible leader in bringing other white people into this struggle. So I know that there will be more information later about hosting these parties yourselves, but I hope that you'll apply to host an abolitionist party yourself, and I'm glad you're here.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you for sharing how you have been personally impacted by the systems abolition seek to transform, and for offering a mutual interest framework that others on this call may relate to. If anyone would like more information about SURJ, you can visit showingupforracialjustice.org. Brittany?
Thanks, Matt, and thanks, Elizabeth. So why are we here thinking about political education when there are thousands of people in the streets every day, all over the country, all over the world, when this feels like a time to take more urgent action? Why do we spend our time educating ourselves? We do political education to ground ourselves in political and historical learning, because dominant culture and media intentionally and consistently misdirect and misinform us. We need to build a shared understanding of our real history that isn't taught in school to know what we're up against. Political education allows us to do this work collectively and build both a shared language and a shared framework for understanding our situation. This allows us then to take more effective action. We know some of you on the call may be wondering whether you support abolition or what that even is. We also know some of you on the call may be greatly impacted by the police and prison systems in this country. We acknowledge the emotional work of connecting these systems to actual experiences, and we want to hold space for all of the feelings that might come up during this session. We are so grateful to have you joining us no matter what place you're coming from today. There is no expectation that everyone will leave here an abolitionist. This is intended to be a space where we can educate ourselves about what abolition is and plant some seeds around building what that world involves and looks like. And doing that standing in solidarity with partners who are abolitionists, the Movement for Black Lives platform, Black Lives Matter, Reform LA Jails campaign, among others. This work is not new, so why are we all talking about abolition right now?
Whether you've been doing anti-racist work for years or whether you're new to this work, I'm sure that you're aware that we are in the midst of a whirlwind moment. There are so many people joining us today because there's so much going on right now. People are ready for change. Since the inception of Black Lives Matter in 2013, and even prior, organizers across the country have been pushing tirelessly for the defunding of the police. But even Patrisse Cullors, one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter, has stated that this moment in time feels different. There lies so much power in organized numbers, and we are seeing the number of vocal emerging activists grow and grow. A political scientist from Harvard, Erica Chenoweth, conducted research on hundreds of movements over the last century and found that it takes 3.5% of a population actively participating to accomplish tangible change. So for white folks in the United States, that means organizing and activating 7 million of us to commit to anti-racist actions. This also means that each of us has to commit to personal work on ourselves, and education is such a powerful tool that we have at our disposal. Perhaps throughout the recent news cycle, you've been hearing this word abolition more and more. So today, we're talking about abolishing both the police and prison systems in this country. They have proven time and time again to be ineffective at helping our communities, and they provide more harm than good. I get it. It might be confusing or scary to imagine a world without police, but when you realize that supporting abolition is actually a bold commitment to effective care, you might just change your mind. We are leading with empathy and with compassion. Today, because of all of you here, we are one step closer to reaching that 7 million. This is an uprising. Let's dive in.
Yes, let's dive in. So we want to start by hearing from all of you. So a poll is going to appear on your screen, and we want to know how you'd respond to this statement. So now, how strongly do you believe the police make your community a safer space for everyone? Okay, yeah, so we're just, oh, I got a different poll appearing on my screen now. When you were growing up, this is the poll that we wanted you to answer first. When you were growing up, how strongly did you believe the police made your community a safer space for everyone? So yeah, I'm just seeing the responses come in. I know for me growing up, I certainly believed that as a white person living in a neighborhood with a lot of class privilege, I was absolutely felt that calling the police was what I was supposed to do if I ever needed help or anything like that. And as we're seeing, we can close this poll and show everyone what we've got here. So yeah, so about 40% of us said 5 completely believed growing up that the police made our community safer for everyone. almost, over 70% of us believe we're at a 4 or a 5 on that, and only 5% of people, so only about 36 people out of the over 900 on this call didn't believe that growing up, that the police made the community a safer space for everyone. So now let's go back to this other poll that briefly flashed up on the screen. So we're curious to know, if you think about this same question now, how strongly do you now believe that the police make your community a safer space for everyone? So yeah, watching, I know for me, there's been a mass transformation on this. I'm definitely at a 1 now, if not a negative number, if it were possible on this poll. And we're seeing, we can throw those results up on the screen. I know not everyone might have had a chance to complete the poll yet, but we can see here that, my math skills are not the best, but it's over 90% of us said between a 1 and a 2 now, that we believe that the police make the community a safer space for everyone. So really just a high level of disagreement. Nobody was at a 5 now compared to the majority of people the first time around. So as we can see, many of us have shifted a lot in how we feel about this question. And we're going to spend the rest of this time diving into some of the details of how that, of the nitty gritty of that shift in our mindsets.
Yeah, what may have seemed like an easy answer as children is clearly no longer so simple. The complexity of policing and prisons is before us in a unique way right now. One way we are invited to consider moving forward is through the calls we hear echoed for abolition. So, what are people talking about when they say abolition? We'll use a working and abridged definition given to us by Critical Resistance to highlight 3 of the key components. You can feel free to follow along if you would like as I read. First, abolition is a political vision that seeks to eliminate the need for prisons, policing, and surveillance by creating sustainable alternatives. The emphasis here is on creating other ways of doing things rather than simply tolerating more of the horrible same. Next, abolition isn't simply about getting rid of buildings full of cages, prisons, and jails, but about undoing the society we live in, because the system we are working to end both feeds on and perpetuates structural oppression and inequalities through punishment, violence, and the control of literally millions of people. Because the prison industrial complex is not an isolated system, abolition is a broad strategy. The recognition here is that because the problem is more than just buildings, because it is a societal cultural piece made of many systems, we need a wide enough strategy to get us to where we need to be. And finally, an abolitionist vision means that we must build models today that can represent how we want to live in the future. It means developing practical strategies for taking small steps that move us toward making our dreams real and that lead the average person to believe that things really could be different. It means living this vision in our daily lives. Abolition is both a practical organizing tool and a long-term goal. Said another way, we cannot forget abolition is both the process and the goal, and each small step we take must make those dreams closer to reality.
Yeah, one of the biggest ahas for me around abolition was, at its core, it's less about being against police and prisons and more about being for a different, better world where there's liberation, justice, connection, care, and respect. It's about creating sustainable alternatives where we honor everyone's humanness so deeply that we don't need prisons and police. At its core, it's about changing the way we relate to each other and how we react when people cause harm. When we think about the whole system, it can feel big and distant, but when it comes down to is relationships and how we relate to each other in our communities, and taking small steps that move us toward the world we want to live in. This will not be something that just happens overnight.
I love what Brittany just said. I know that it can feel very overwhelming to think about changing an entire system, but we need to see it not just as an end goal, but also as a process of incremental changes that get us to this new way of being and relating to each other. The late Rose Braz, a longtime staffer and member of Critical Resistance, emphasized this point in a 2008 interview. She said, "A prerequisite to seeking any social change is the naming of it." In other words, even though the goal we seek may be far away, unless we name it and fight for it today, it will never come.
So now we will have a chance to reflect. So for the next 3 minutes, we invite you to journal, doodle, whatever process you have to process the information that we've presented, and a few questions for you to reflect on if any of them strike you. First, when you hear about the facets of abolition, what feelings come up for you? Next, what's something you just heard that you've never considered before? Third, where do you feel hesitation or resistance to what you just heard? Finally, how are the ideas described similar or different to what you thought about abolition before attending this session? Please take 3 minutes and dive into whatever of those feel like the right place for you.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Hopefully you got a chance to reflect on at least one of those juicy questions. So I'm going to now dive into thinking about what's the difference between what we call reformist reforms and abolitionist reforms, which was something that the definition of abolition Matt introduced us to before distinguishes between. So that definition we provided talks about building practical strategies to take small steps towards the world we're dreaming of. And that is distinguishing between reformist reforms and abolitionist reforms. So reformist reforms are changes that continue to expand the power of policing and prisons. They don't actually lessen the existence or size of those systems and often make them more permanent. They give the idea that policing can be done, quote, right, rather than seeing the systemic role policing plays in perpetuating harm. Abolitionist reforms, on the other hand, work to chip away at and reduce the overall impact, scale, resources, and power of policing and prisons so that those resources we're currently spending can be moved into programs and services that will meet our community's needs. So I find specific examples really helpful to understand this. So we're just going to look at a couple here, and in the resources we send you after, there's more examples. So a reformist reform would be body cameras. So many of us have probably heard that body cameras are the solution to the problems we have with policing in this country. But let's look at why this is a reformist reform. So body cameras actually increase funding to police. They need money to buy the cameras, to train how to use the cameras, to maintain the cameras, to keep the technology up to date, etc. So it actually increases not only the funding to police, but the tools, tactics, and technology the police have at their disposal. So it's actually increasing the overall scale of policing in our communities. It doesn't do anything to change police violence or power. It simply gives them a camera that documents the inevitable and often legally protected abuse that police are perpetuating. Now, let's contrast this with an abolitionist reform. So an abolitionist reform would be requiring cops to be liable in misconduct settlements, which they currently aren't. For us in Los Angeles, for instance, when the Los Angeles Police Department is sued for misconduct, the department the police department is not held liable. The city is. So misconduct settlements are actually paid out of LA's city general fund, which is our tax dollars. It's my money and the money of the rest of us who live in Los Angeles. This absence of accountability is not just something seen in LAPD, it's a reality all over the country. And making an abolitionist step would be requiring that the cops actually pay for their own, the police departments pay for their own misconduct settlements. So doing this would increase community-based budgets, as local governments wouldn't have to spend that money any longer paying for police's harms against the community. Instead of that money coming out of the general fund for those misconduct suits, that money could come out of the general fund and go to community services. It also challenges the notion that policing and all its costs are essential components of safety. They aren't. Community members should not pay for the inevitable violence of the police and prison system. It would reduce the expansion of tools used by police and create pressure for police to account for their actions, at least financially. And lastly, it would decrease the size, scope, and capacity of the system of policing and move us closer towards abolition.
Thank you, Rachel. So how did we get to the moment that we're in? History, despite its wrenching pain, cannot be unlived, but if faced with courage, need not be lived again. Maya Angelou. For us to understand the power and devastating impact of police and prisons today, we must look at their long and inhumane history. We can trace the lineage of prisons and police back to slavery and before. These systems are inextricably linked and have direct ties to the atrocities and the violence we see today. But let us remember that there was always a time before police and prisons, and there will be a time after. We want to say up front that we realize we will be reviewing over 400 years of terrifying history in around 10 minutes, and many important details and events will not be able to be discussed and expanded on. But we'll try our best.
Thanks, Brittany. Here goes. So for around 250 years, slavery fueled the American economy in the South. It was all about money. White landowners and enslavers relied on exploited, forced Black labor for profit. Fearing rebellions, these patrols of white men developed as one of the earliest and most prolific forms of early policing in the US. Their job was literally to control the movement and behaviors of enslaved Black people through dehumanization, torture, kidnapping, rape, and other unspeakably violent acts. During this time, enslaved people were simply seen as property, and the role of police was to protect white property over Black people. Policing of Black bodies was seen as the role of the good white citizen. Moving us into the American Revolution, in 1776, we all know the colonies formed into a nation state, and so became the USA. At this point, a national militia was formed in the effort to remove the British, and a national constitution provided for the maintenance of a military and a national guard. So this was the clear beginning of a militarized police state. Although schools may teach July 4th as a big celebration of freedom and independence, enslaved people did not gain their independence until June 19th, 1865, or Juneteenth. Local patrols and the national militias often actually worked together to return enslaved people back into bondage. So this whole period established a sense of security for white male landowners, and they were only 15% of the population, only 15%. And this was all at the expense of the other 85%. And they did this through indigenous genocide, through African slavery, and through denying political rights to poor whites and to women.
Okay, so fast forward a little to the post-Civil War period. So slavery is outlawed with the 13th Amendment to the Constitution. At least that is the claim, and that is what we learn often in school. However, there was a loophole that slave labor could continue as, quote, punishment for a crime. So this created an incentive for whites in power to arrest Black people and put them in jails and prisons to exploit their labor and prevent their entry into wage labor and gaining any political power. Emancipation was followed immediately by Black codes, which were laws created to restrict Black people's freedom, designed to re-enslave the Black community for harmless everyday actions like owning property or being absent from work. The white corporate economy was also profiting off of free prison labor during this time with convict leasing programs where prisoners were leased out to do work at private plantations, coal mines, and railroad yards. So clearly we can see that slavery really just took on a new form. In the Progressive era, starting around the 1890s through the 1920s, the span of policing broadened as parole and probation systems were formed, which expanded the role of state surveillance. People were now not only being surveilled while they were in prison or jail, but also afterwards. The government also created state police forces to meet the demands of corporations that were trying to squash union organizing and labor strikes during this time, because the companies didn't want to bear the expense themselves of doing this work of quashing labor unions and labor strikes. So by the end of the 1930s, every state had some form of state police agency. In this time also, Jim Crow laws and segregation made it illegal for Black people to try and operate as white people did in the public sphere, thus preventing social advancement and access to wealth. Incarceration and police violence were tools the police used when Black people dared to challenge these racist laws.
And obviously, throughout each of these periods, there was incredible resistance, like the following period during the Civil Rights Movement from 1954 to 1968. But that never stops the state from finding new ways to bring violence. Various police agencies, the FBI and SWAT, were established with expanded crime-fighting responsibilities and power. Programs like COINTELPRO, a secret FBI program, were created to actively monitor and target Black liberatory groups, as well as to disrupt civil rights and Black power activities. The Black Panther Party was seen as the greatest internal threat to the country by the FBI for simply trying to create cooperative security for the Black community. And for that, COINTELPRO sought to dismantle this movement for justice by, among other things, assassinating and incarcerating key leaders. Another facet of that era was that those same police were finally able to form unions after decades of quashed attempts. But since their inception, police unions have consistently and successfully protected police from any accountability for their actions, their misconduct, and their violence, as we see today. And finally, though the prison population in the United States was largely consistent throughout most of the 20th century, it was at the end of this period that the incarceration population began to explode.
So that brings us to 1970. The US prison population was about 350,000. And again, like Matt had mentioned, stayed consistent throughout most of the 20th century. The war on drugs and racial profiling in the 1970s began to establish mass incarceration in the US. And by the year 1990, the US prison population was over 1.1 million people. So in 1970, it was about 350,000. And then 20 years later, it's jumped up to 1.1 million. The $30 billion 1994 crime bill allowed for massive expansion for the prison system and provided law enforcement with money and incentives to make as many drug arrests as possible. Further criminalization of poverty worked to move many of the most economically marginalized, including youth, into the prison system. And by the year 2000, the US prison population had reached more than 2 million people. And today, 2.3 million people are behind bars. 1970, we had 350,000, and now 2.3 million. The US has the highest rate of incarceration in the world, and only 5% of the global population, but housing 25% of the world's prisoners. Before the incredible victories of organizers recently, during this COVID-19 time, Los Angeles County jails, where the facilitators are located, or in Los Angeles County, the jails had an average daily population nearing 22,000, which made LA's jail system the biggest in the world. During this period of time from 1970 to now, the police also became much more militarized, and especially post 9/11, widely increased their surveillance tactics. They were equipped with military-grade weapons, which they continue to use on US citizens. Tear gas, being one of these weapons, was actually banned internationally by the Geneva Convention of 1925 as a chemical weapon of war, but this is still commonly used daily to attack protesters. Despite all of this, again, there was a time before police and prisons, and there will be a time after them.
Obviously, this is just a small sampling of the history from before today up until now. But given that, we're going to open the chat and invite you to let us and each other know which piece of history surprised you the most. Was there a period you thought you understood, but now recognize you were misinformed about? What stood out to you? Appreciate all the extra history being put into the chat. Look at the impact of the '94 crime bill, and that's present today.
I see power of police unions.
I was also very misinformed about Reconstruction. What I learned in school, rather. The loophole in the
tear
13th.
gas as a chemical weapon. I was, yes, did not know that as well a couple weeks ago.
Thank you all for putting those in the chat. Please feel free to continue as we continue on.
Yes, thank you all. So, as we have seen, this country has a deep and a devastating history of prisons and police that spans over 400 years. And it's really important to note that these violent systems continue to operate exactly as they were designed, to promote and protect wealthy white business owners and communities at the expense of everyone else. Today, the total number of people in US jails is 746,000 people. And 74% of those people have not even been convicted of a crime. I'm going to repeat that. 74% of the people in US jails have not even been convicted of a crime. That's 552,000 people, like 500,000 people. And this is, because of these local bail practices, most of these people are locked up simply because they cannot afford to get out. We've been completely misdirected to think that these systems make us safer and that locking up 2.3 million people just magically solves all of the challenges in our society. And centuries of using this feudal logic proves that this is simply not true. Furthermore, this misdirection is the result of a culture and a media that feeds stereotypes and engages in fear baiting. It's entirely fear-based. This idea that if we put anyone in prison, anything will get better is completely a lie. Our systems make no commitment to real accountability, rehabilitation, justice, and community well-being. And importantly, these systems have removed us from one another. And that's actually ultimately where our safety and support comes from: interpersonal relationships, community building. But they have instilled this misplaced fear about where the problems are and how we're supposed to solve them. In actuality, our community's greatest risk and harm come from the violence perpetuated by these systems and the systems that they uphold. And this is why reform is just not possible. You cannot just fix a system that was built on violence. You have to rebuild it from the ground up.
The brilliant Angela Davis, who has spent decades championing and researching abolition, wrote in 1998, "Prisons do not disappear social problems. They disappear human beings. Homelessness, unemployment, drug addiction, mental illness, and illiteracy are only a few of the problems that disappear from public view when the human beings contending with them are relegated to cages." Social problems are criminalized rather than addressed, and now we have 2.3 million people forced into cages. When they are finally released, our system continues to control and surveil them through probation and parole systems that further alienate people from the opportunities, programs, and communities that could help. It's time to address the root of people's needs directly.
This all might leave us at an uncertain place, confused about how to proceed. Fear not. In order to connect the history we just discussed with the new abolitionist movement today, we're going to watch a video with Black Lives Matter activist Janiyah Khan from May 27th, 2017. In the video, they explain how we can abolish the whole criminal justice system through transformative justice. Enjoy.
It's not just one bad apple. The whole damn tree is rotten. I think when people hear that we're anti-police, they think it's going to be chaos. The new abolitionist movement it's about transformative justice, non-prison, non-police-based strategies for dealing with violence and crisis in our communities. Who hasn't had a bad day? Who hasn't felt anxious or depressed? The question is, should anybody deserve to die because of it? The police's sole responsibility is to manufacture criminals. So here you have for-profit prisons. When you create space, you create a demand. That means that bodies have to fill those prisons. And we have seen that it's largely transgender people, it's Black people, it is Native people, it's Latinx people. When you have that demand, then you also have to create incentives. That trickles down to police, who also now have the incentive of creating criminals. It's not about justice anymore, it's about profit. I think we start with the demilitarization of the police. Police don't need assault weapons to protect people. The second thing that we can do is really look at police budgets and create models and economies for that divestment from the institution of policing and the reinvestment in community models. That means taking money out of police budgets and slowly phasing out police because we don't actually need them in our communities. They don't keep people safe. You know, when you're looking at it from the lens of race in this country, it's absolutely easier to manufacture criminals around that. When people's skin becomes weaponized, particularly Black skin, a book becomes a gun, a cell phone becomes a gun, a bag of Skittles becomes a gun. We don't have some personal war with individual police officers. What we do have is deep concern and a fight against the institution of policing. Undocumented communities know that they can't call the police in the event that crisis happens. A lot of Black communities know that too. And so entire mosques, churches, communities, they have agreements where they won't call the police should something happen. And in its place, we've seen such a wonderful and diverse response when it comes to intervention in our communities. We've seen people rise up with trainings around mental health crisis, intimate partner violence crisis. We've seen rapid response justice teams, and I think that's really what we need to be building. Revolution isn't just the ending of something, it's the beginning of something new.
Wow. Revolution isn't just the ending of something, it's the beginning of something new. That's it. We just went over a lot of information with you all. Let's just maybe take a halfway moment to take a breath. Breathe in and breathe out. And feel free to enter into the chat just maybe one word to describe how you're feeling in this moment. Yeah, really all over the map. Inspired, overwhelmed, ready, hopeful, sad.
Committed. I like that.
Right. Oh. I don't know if you all can see me right now. Oh, okay. I couldn't see myself, but there we go. Okay. So, as a way to dig deeper into this conversation of police abolition, we're now going to also listen to an excerpt from a podcast called The Appeal. This is episode 7, What Abolitionists Mean When They Talk About Abolition. And it's going to be a conversation with the host, Adam H. Johnson, and William C. Anderson, who's an abolitionist, journalist, and co-author of As Black as Resistance. This originally aired July 12th, 2018. There's a term they're going to use in this 3-minute excerpt we're going to listen to, which is austerity. Austerity deals with reducing government budget deficits by reducing spending on social services. So it's balancing budgets on the backs of the most vulnerable by cutting those services that serve those people the most. And this will give some context to their conversation. So we're just going to listen to about 3 minutes, and there'll be a transcript in the chat.
Okay, so in your piece, you talk about how austerity rhetoric is very favorable to policing, and the austerity fetish that is in our country, it is increasingly in Europe, goes hand in hand with what Professor Stephanie Coleman at Northwestern University Pritzker School of Law calls the, quote, scarcity logic. And she says it's always been used to simultaneously starve police misconduct investigations and invest in suppression squads and surveillance activities. What does she mean by this? When we talk about how austerity and police go hand in hand, what are we talking about?
It's basically a recognition of how the communities that are most in need are starved. They're intentionally starved, and at the same time told that there are not enough resources for them. There's not enough to give to them to meet their needs that they very well deserve. It's this use of the police in this really, really terrible way that it's like a big circle, you know. It's like you have on one hand the austerity saying we don't have enough, like we have to take from the resources that communities need. Maybe some people might, you know, describe that as taking away from people's human rights. At the same token, saying that there's not enough money, constantly reinvesting into police. And so there's like this circle that happens where at the time that you're starving communities and you're intentionally strickening resources from communities and saying that there's not enough, you're reinvesting into the police. So it goes back to what I was saying earlier about communities not having enough resources and not having their needs met, and creating more problems through not allowing the resources that communities need to get to them, and then saying that there is money for the police and that we have to put more into the police at the same time. So it's like, it's a very purposeful connection that's happening there, because again, if you were putting the resources and investing into the communities in the first place, the problems that you're supposedly solving with the police, which are not actually being solved with the police, would be lessened. You know, it wouldn't be as much of an issue. Put the resources into the community, like give people what they need. Stop, you know, allowing corporations to amass these astronomical amounts of wealth, and have an actual system where people, you know, have to pay taxes, like just do normal stuff. Like corporations are not even paying taxes in this country. Yeah. And it's like, then they say like, oh, we don't have enough money for communities that have, you know, high crime rates. What? Yes, you do. You have enough money. Like at the very least, we could be demanding that corporations pay taxes.
And as we enter the beginning of the economic havoc that COVID-19 will wreak in our communities, and as austerity measures start to pop up in local government budgets in every department but policing, it's time for a transformatively new approach. As William C. Anderson also said, I think that we have to push against this idea that reform is even something that we should be viewing as a goal. I think that reform has a lot of the logics of liberalism kind of built into it. And I think we just need to be telling people abolition is necessary. Folks like myself and others who are considered quote unquote radical, it's unfortunate these views that everybody should have health care, or that education should be free, or that we should live in a society free from police are considered radical because they're actually normal. And they're actually not that controversial in many places. So it's really a testament to how backwards things are in the USA.
Thanks, Matt. I love that quote, and I love that whole podcast. So in thinking about what he just said, for the next 2 minutes, we're going to do another individual reflection. So please journal or reflect on any of the following questions. What do you feel after listening to this clip? What did it specifically bring up for you? And think about this. If you were in charge of your city's budget, how would you distribute the funds? What community resources or programs would be important alternatives to invest in over the police? We'll play some music.
Thank you all so much for journaling on that. We have the power to create the world that we want to live in. We just have to imagine it, name it, and have the courage to demand it. You just journaled on what community resources would be important alternatives to invest in. So please enter into the chat. What is one community program or service you think is the most important to fund in your community? If I had to put one right now, I would say quality, free, safe education for all people, which means no police in schools.
Yeah, I would say healthcare, both mental and holistic care to all people as a human right. I'm seeing a lot of that in the chat.
And mine is in the chat as well. Extremely affordable, no barrier supportive housing.
Yeah, I would say access to restorative justice and ways of learning to deal with conflict in healthy and generative ways that don't involve having to call the police.
These are all fantastic ideas. I want to live in the society that everyone is talking about in the chat. So there are viable alternative realities to having police in our streets and prisons in our communities. And building a world without them will need community-led alternatives to harm that lead with care. So here are a few visions for what that better world could look like. And this is from the Instagram account, Conflict Transformation. So picture it. Some folks are sleeping on benches in the park. Imagine a city employee comes by and checks in to see if they need a place to sleep, food, water, or healthcare. An hour later, those who want a different place to sleep have one. Isn't that public safety? Or someone is behaving erratically and they're in harm's way. Imagine texting a number and an unarmed, urgent responder trained in behavioral and mental health comes within 5 minutes. An hour later, that person is safe and getting the support they need. Isn't that public safety? Or someone is selling drugs to youth who are overdosing. Imagine being connected to a substance use service that intervenes in harmful drug transactions. The youth are supported in healthy outcomes, and the seller takes accountability for harm. Isn't that public safety?
You're experiencing intimate partner violence. Imagine texting a number and a trauma-informed crisis intervention specialist meets you in a safe place. An hour later, you are working together to make a plan that will keep you safe long-term. Isn't that public safety? You are experiencing a mental health crisis and afraid. Imagine you call a 311 number and a first responder trained in mental health comes to your door. An hour later, you are in a safe place with your consent with plans for follow-up care. Isn't that public safety? Someone seems to be snooping in car windows on your block. Imagine calling your neighbors who are trained in self-defense and de-escalation and approaching the person. An hour later, the conflict is resolved and the person responsible is getting the support they need. Isn't that public safety?
Your friends are intoxicated and fighting, but you don't want them to get in trouble. Imagine you call a 311 number and a crisis intervention team comes to your door. An hour later, your friends are sleeping it off at home. Isn't that public safety? Or you don't realize, but your brake lights aren't working. Imagine a city employee signals for you to pull over and says, "Hey, how about I replace those lights for you right here so no one gets hurt?" An hour later, both lights work and you're at home. Isn't that public safety? Or incidents of gun violence are rising in the neighborhood. Imagine a trauma-informed crisis intervention team works with community activists to disarm and de-escalate conflicts. People doing harm are connected to services that address the underlying problems. Isn't that public safety?
So these are all great visions, albeit not necessarily fully fleshed out for what safe communities can look like. But some of you may still be wondering about some other scenarios. What about the murderers? What about the rapists, the sociopaths, the dangerous people in our communities? we know these are very real questions that we ask. So we're going to offer a few responses to that here, and I encourage you to look in the resources that we send out for some deeper responses. So the first thing is that, contrary to what we see on TV and TV shows, fiction, and the news, most people, there's not actually that many murderers and rapists just running wild, murdering and raping strangers in our society. Most people murder people they know well, often as part of complex family relationships and violence dynamics. TV makes us think prisons are full of murderers who would go on killing sprees if released, but it's actually an inaccurate portrayal of how violence most commonly happens and who is in prison right now. Most sexual assault also happens between people who know each other rather than the stranger serial rapist portrayed on TV. Sexual assault is most often not reported, and most people who engage in it are not in prison. So ending prisons will not flood society with rapist predators. TV cop shows make it seem like prisons are full of serial killers, but prisons are full of people from vulnerable communities who are in desperate situations and engaged with drugs, property crimes, or conflict with their friends, lovers, and families more than anybody else. So these are still valid questions. Harm happens in our communities. Harm will continue to happen in our communities, whether we have police and prisons. But one thing that we know for sure is that police and prisons do not solve these things at all and have never solved them. So we must look for actual solutions, like addressing the complex issues at their core, to really make our society safer. And even then, we will still have harm happen in our societies. That's real, that's true. We can't fund all the social services in the world and make harm disappear among people. But what we're asking you to really do today is really come with us on this journey of knowing that we can know police and prisons aren't the solution without having everything figured out about abolition and what exactly it's going to look like. We have lots of good ideas, and society's always evolving and a work in progress. So we ask you to just be open to imagining and believing in better and different situations and solutions.
So what would be the step to get us to do this and to actually make these visions a reality? How do we build the world we want to live in and get rid of prisons and police? We take care of and invest in communities. This is not a pipe dream, and it can happen. Police and prison abolition will not happen by magically snapping our fingers and simultaneously defunding the policing systems of the world all instantly. It's a gradual process of strategically reallocating resources, funding, and responsibility away from those systems and toward alternative community-based models of care. And there are already roadmaps for us to follow on just how those models would work, like the image on the slide, the Los Angeles County Alternatives to Incarceration's Work Group Report.
So this report came out of last year. The Los Angeles County Board of Supervisors passed a motion where they brought together community advocates, service providers, community members, and staff from multiple county departments to develop a roadmap for diverting people from jail into care. So this Alternatives to Incarceration work group was formed and developed and approved 114 recommendations to provide treatment and services to those in need instead of jail and arrest. So these are 114 really specific policy and other solutions that we can take right now to divert people from arrest and jail into care. And if we can successfully implement these recommendations, some immediately and some over time, we can redefine the roles of our healthcare and criminal justice systems. We can commit to no longer rely on our law enforcement agencies, courts, and jails to function as our social safety net, and actually invest in our communities, reinvest in our communities to build a robust system of care.
And so, to position ATI for implementation and ensure the roadmap was actionable, the planning team organized their recommendations into 5 overarching strategies and 26 foundational recommendations to kickstart implementation. The 5 strategies include Strategy 1, expand and scale community-based holistic care and services through sustainable and equitable community capacity building and service coordination. Strategy 2, utilize behavioral health responses for individuals experiencing mental health and/or substance use disorders, houselessness, and other situations caused by unmet needs. Avoid and minimize law enforcement responses.
Strategy 3, support and deliver meaningful pretrial release and diversion services. Strategy 4, provide effective treatment services in alternative placements instead of jail time. And strategy 5, effectively coordinate the implementation of ATI recommendations, ensuring that strategies work to eliminate racial disparities and to authentically engage and compensate system-impacted individuals.
So these strategies are very specific, but they're not specific to Los Angeles. This vision can be implemented in any community. These strategies and recommendations in the report redistribute money and power to fund the infrastructure so that we don't need to rely on law enforcement ever. Rather than arresting people and sticking them in jail because their needs aren't being met, we meet their needs. We do not need police or prisons. We really don't. It's even more affordable to invest in communities over cops and jails, an added bonus. And we know how to do this. We do it all the time in our personal lives with loved ones. The solutions and visions for the world we want to live in are real. They're available. They really just need to be implemented.
So to bring this conversation that we've been having into the present moment, we're going to listen to an interview from June 3rd, 2020, with the leader and co-founder of the Black Lives Matter movement, Patrisse Cullors, in conversation with Boston NPR on a program called Here and Now. And just a note, we probably are going to run maybe 5-10 minutes over the 6:30 hour, but we are beginning to wrap up. So the transcript for this interview is going to be placed in the chat, and we're just going to listen to about 5 minutes of it now.
Patrisse Cullors joins us now on Skype. She co-founded Black Lives Matter in 2013. And Patrisse, since 2013, we've seen mass protests against police violence in Ferguson, Missouri after the killing of Michael Brown, in Baltimore after the death of Freddie Gray, really across the country. And now we're here again. Does this moment feel different to you?
This moment feels a lot of the same. A lot of the same kind of pain, a lot of the same kind of rage, but different because last time we experienced this moment, we didn't have as much national organization around what to do, and we've spent the last 7 years building out deep ties across the country because if we knew we would have a moment like this again, and now we get to actually respond differently.
We've seen some police officers face consequences amid these protests. In Minneapolis, the officer who knelt on George Floyd's neck for more than 8 minutes has been charged. The mayor of Louisville fired his chief of police after the killing of a store owner there. What do you think would constitute justice in this moment that we're in right now?
For a lot of people, they want accountability for what these officers have done. So some people are asking for prosecuting law enforcement. I think that's a fine demand, and I think that's not a demand rooted in us being able to change the system. It's holding an individual accountable for their actions. An individual that is tied to an institution that has caused a lot of destruction. So I get that demand, but I do think that the the demand of defunding law enforcement becomes a central demand, and how we actually get real accountability and justice, because it means that we are reducing the ability for law enforcement to have resources that harm our communities. And with that demand, it's not just about taking away money from the police, it's about reinvesting those dollars into Black communities, communities that have been deeply divested from, communities that some have never felt the impact of having true resources. And so we have to reconsider what we're resourcing. I've been saying we have an economy of punishment over an economy of care.
But what do you say to this argument that it's not that less money is needed to be spent on police, but actually reallocating the way that money is spent so that police can be used for the good of communities and not in opposition of them?
Oh, it's not possible for law enforcement, the entity of law enforcement, to be a compassionate, caring governmental agency in Black communities. That's not the training, that's not the institution. We have spent the last 7 years asking for training, asking for body cameras. The body cameras have done nothing more than show us what's happening over and over again. The training has done nothing but show us that law enforcement and the culture of law enforcement is incapable of changing. And so what we're asking for is a reinvestment on how we understand what's needed in our communities. Why is law enforcement the first responders for mental health crisis? Why are they the first responders for domestic violence issues? Why are they the first responders for homelessness? And so those are the first places we can look into, let alone let's talk about law enforcement's ability to surveil the community and how much money they're given in surveillance dollars every single year. We have allowed, the public has allowed for us to have militarized police forces in our communities, and we have to stop it.
So do you think, we've been talking a lot about these videos that have gone viral of protests around the country, of police officers kneeling and marching with protesters. Do you see these as distractions, or are you encouraged by these moments? Or do you feel like they're PR?
Colin Kaepernick was banned from the NFL for taking a knee for Black people. Specifically looking at the ways law enforcement violence has impacted us. When the police take a knee, not only do I not take it seriously, it's disingenuous. Taking a knee is not stopping the deaths of our community members. We need radical shifts. We need transformation. These things don't happen through police taking a knee at protests and then right after they take a knee, getting up and tear gassing us and rubber bulleting us and beating us with batons.
That's Patrisse Cullors. She is one of the co-founders of Black Lives Matter. Patrisse, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Patrisse is just so brilliant. So with that said, this is not a fever dream. Abolition is actually happening right now, and it's gaining incredible momentum and victories in this very moment. So all across the country, cities like Dallas, Philadelphia, Los Angeles, and New York are all taking action to defund the police and redirect resources into community programs. In Minneapolis, the city council unanimously voted to disband their police department. And San Francisco is replacing armed officers with trained unarmed professionals to respond to mental health, to the unhoused, to school discipline, and to neighbor disputes. And speaking of schools, other cities who are seeing how the police receive money that students and schools actually deserve, other cities are using this moment to try and remove police from schools in cities like Minneapolis, Portland, Denver, San Francisco, and Oakland.
But the prison industrial complex also loses power and resources when we remove people from their cages. And all over the country, jail populations are being dramatically decreased as the threat of infectious disease spreads. In Los Angeles, our jail population was reduced by 30%. 45% of Orange counties were also reduced. And activists have also worked to get a temporary reduction in bail to $0 for most misdemeanors and some low-level felony offenses. These are just some of them. We know you are carrying more of the stories of victory from your communities and your neighborhoods. Please take a moment to throw them into the chat right now so we can hear the ways that abolitionist steps are being seen where you come from. The abolition of police in Berkeley.
Yes, and hopefully we can just continue to keep seeing headline after headline as we just continue to build consciousness around this in our communities. Patrisse Cullors, who we just listened to in the interview, wrote a piece in the Harvard Law Review in April 2019 titled Abolition and Reparations, Histories of Resistance, Transformative Justice, and Accountability. In the piece, she reminds folks in a series of personal vignettes about abolition, about what abolition is, and which principles we should reference in our own abolitionist work. The point here is that abolition isn't just a grand social idea, but we can make a choice to live it out every day in our own lives. I'm going to read those 12 principles now. My abolitionist journey embodies the following 12 principles. 1, have courageous conversations. 2, commit to response versus reaction. 3, experiment, nothing is fixed. 4, say yes to one's imagination. 5, forgive actively versus passively. 6, allow oneself to feel. 7, commit to not harming or abusing others. 8, practice accountability for harm caused. 9, embrace non-reformist reforms. 10, build community. 11, value interpersonal relationships. And 12, fight the US state and do not make it stronger. So Patrisse asks us to sit with these, to reflect on our own experiences, and to begin to sketch out our own abolitionist practice. Which one of these principles is resonating the most with you? Go ahead and drop a number in the chat. I think today the one that's resonating the most with me would be 12.
Yeah, every
and
time
really all of them.
Yeah, every time I hear it, something else sticks out. I'm really focusing on 2 today, and what that means in my interpersonal relationships. So, thank you all for reflecting and letting us know which of those abolitionist principles is affecting you most. We're going to move to our closing segment. Once again, we are highlighting Patrisse's fantastic mind. So this is a quote of hers. She says, "For hundreds of years, Black communities have lived under state terror, be it police violence or vigilante violence. When Black people uprise, we must call it what it is: a human reaction to a deeply unstable and dysfunctional relationship to a country that has dehumanized us for centuries. I am less concerned with corporations and the ways they are impacted by Black pain, and I am more interested in the freedom of Black people. Our demand is no longer about the accountability of law enforcement. Law enforcement is unable to be accountable. We must defund law enforcement and reimagine a world that relies on an economy of care versus an economy of punishment. That's Patrisse Cullors, co-founder of Black Lives Matter.
Okay, thank you, Juliet, and thank you, Patrisse. So as we come to a close here, here's what we are hoping. So you have all spent the last 96 minutes with us, and it's our ask that you share this information with your communities. When you leave here today, you'll be emailed a recording of this webinar and additional resources from both White People for Black Lives and SURJ. And we hope you're going to take these resources and expand more on these ideas, bring these topics into conversation with your loved ones, continue to pass on this information. We like to think of it as an ethical racial justice pyramid scheme, if you will. This is a leaderful movement, and we want all of you to be leaders in these conversations in your communities, whether this was your first time really diving into abolition today, or you've been doing this for years and years. You can be a leader in this work. And I'm going to pass it to Sarah now from SURJ, who's going to talk about the real practical next steps you can take to take lead in your communities.
Hey y'all, I want you to stay on with us for another 5 minutes because I have a very important ask of you to host your own house party. So before I get into all of it, I just want to first say a really big thank you to White People for Black Lives for their facilitation, the tech crew, the ASL interpreters, and the entire team who made this webinar come to life. And another really big thank you to Elizabeth for sharing her story and reminding us to connect to abolition from a place of mutual interest. So my short story is that I grew up in rural South Dakota. Across the street from my dad's house was a state prison. So I literally looked into a prison from my bedroom window. But before I was born, that state prison had been a college. So turning a college into a prison changed literally every aspect of this town with less than 1,000 people. And like many folks from rural white working class communities, members of my family worked at the prison for economic survival. And like many folks from all sorts of backgrounds, I experienced violence in my own home. So as a young child, I remember calling the police and watching them tell my dad to simply cool off, but then doing nothing for real safety or accountability. His white masculinity protected him from the violence of the cops while harming us because the cops did nothing to keep us safe. So I come to abolition because I know that had there been a different community resource to call focused on transformative justice, I might have a relationship with my dad today. And I think that we ought to have tools to resolve conflict and create safety in families without needing the police, who often intervene in with far more violent ways directed at people of color than they did in my personal situation. And I also believe that we can have a world where we don't need a prison because prisons are offering no real process for healing or transformation, either for the people who are inside or for people outside if they experienced harm. So I know that all of you have a story that connects you to the need for abolition, even if you aren't sure what's at stake for you right now or what that story is. And I also know that having more conversations across the country about abolition will support transforming our collective imagination to actually implement solutions today, which is the very important work that Patrisse Cullors named in the quote that you all just heard. So I'm really excited to invite you to apply to a 7-week pilot program that will entail running an abolition house party in your community or your network while receiving organizing, training, and coaching from July 8th to August 19th. So you will have a coach and a learning community and receive organizing trainings on Wednesday nights for 7 weeks that culminate in you hosting and organizing an abolition house party in your own community the weekend of August 14th. So I want to encourage everybody to apply, and we'll put that in the chat, and we'll be sending out that information again. We are especially interested in developing the leadership of SURJ members who are themselves impacted by prisons or policing, identify as a survivor of violence or as poor or working class, are disabled or may have mental health issues, are rural or Southern. So this is simply because we have identified these folks in our network as having a lot at stake and fighting for abolition alongside people of color. And we want to build the skills and leadership of folks who are, who may be close to the issue. You don't have to have any prior organizing experience. You don't need to be an expert in abolition. I'm not an expert in abolition. And you don't even need to be like a card-carrying abolitionist. You just need to be on this journey with us. And you do need to commit to learning new organizing skills, being comfortable with some discomfort and growth, and bringing these ideas to more people, and to remaining open to what is possible through abolition. So what we're asking for is a big commitment from people who apply to organize an abolition house party, and understand that the short notice or specific time frame may not work out for you right now, but don't worry, because this is the first pilot of this kind of project nationally, and there's going to be a lot more opportunities in the future. So applications, it's very fast turnaround, will be due July 5th by 11 p.m. Pacific time. That's where I live. And you'll be notified by July 6th at 8 p.m. Pacific time about being accepted into the pilot program. So we're looking for 200 participants to join. So please do not be shy, and please apply. And I'm kind of catching some questions in the chat, but just apply, and there's a place in the application to put other notes in there. And we'll also share the organizer packet, which is going to be updated throughout the training with more training materials. So based on tonight, we know political education and personal reflection are powerful tools when paired with organizing for concrete demands. And we hope that these abolition parties will launch or support transformative organizing across the country that can work side by side Black and Brown-led campaigns. We are in a historic moment and hope you will be a part of creating lasting change from the grassroots, both locally and nationally. So will you join us in hosting more spaces for people across the country to explore abolition? I want to see some yeses. I see Max just said yes. Ava's excited. Yeah, if you're excited to join this movement and host an abolition party, put that in the chat. Awesome. I'm very excited to work with all of you over a longer time. Just want to say thank you so much for being with us on the call tonight. Thank you for committing to racial justice, for exploring maybe brand new ideas, and believing that transformation is possible in the world. So I think all of the presenters, if you want to give goodbyes, and folks in the chat can say goodbyes and appreciations. Have a good night.
Take care. Thank you all.
Thank you.